This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Welcome to the American Monetary Association's podcast, where we explore how monetary policy impacts the real lives of real people and the action steps necessary to preserve wealth and enhance one's lifestyle.
It is my pleasure to welcome Neal Bawa to the show. He is known as the Mad Scientist of Multifamily. He's a technologist, a data scientist, and a real estate investor. Neal, welcome. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me on the show, Jason.
It's good to have you. So, you've dealt with a lot of things in your career. You really went down the rabbit hole and looked at blockchain for fractionalizing real estate, which is something that, we've done many shows over the years on that. And it just doesn't seem to be quite coming to pass, does it? Maybe we'll kind of start with that.
Yeah, I think that, I'm holding at any given point of time, $750 million in real estate. And one of the questions that I had was, with real estate, when you build a real estate company, the value is in the real estate itself. So when a property sells, you make profits, and nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't have the multiples that you have with technology companies. So at some point I was like, well, perhaps I could convince my investors to fractionalize some of my assets and build a company that could have technology level multiples, 10x, 100x, whatever it might be. So I spent a significant portion of a year investigating blockchain, and I'm fond of crypto and blockchain and what they meant to represent when they started out. I think it's been warped beyond what it was. Money tends to warp everything. But I looked at it and I said, can I use the blockchain to fractionalize real estate? Because if you think about it, real estate is the largest asset class in the world. It's bigger than all stock markets combined, $300 trillion. But it is also the most illiquid asset class simply because there's no way to sell real estate like stock. And I looked into it and I said, what if there was a way to take commercial real estate, single family real estate, and basically sell it like stock and use the blockchain, and the blockchain basically gives it that credibility, that nobody's selling the same building 10 times over, things like that. The truth is, when I looked into it, the current companies that are trying to take real estate and turn it into blockchain packets, tickets, whatever you want to call them, tokens, are nowhere near the point where this can be really commercialized. I mean, it's the equivalent of solar in the 1990s. I mean, it took solar until 2010 to become financially viable. Before that, all green people were doing it. And I think that's where we are with this. But what is even worse is that the legality of doing it, the way that it makes sense to do it, financially makes sense to do it, is clearly in a very gray area. And not only that, the collapse of the crypto infrastructure, followed by the scandals of FTX and others, means that recently the SEC has issued guidelines taking it from a gray zone basically into a black zone.
Right.
So I backed away because I could not find a way to make it either financially viable or legally viable.
Sure. And well, not just would fractionalizing it be nice, but also it just would, and making it tradable, but it would lower the barrier to entry. I mean, imagine if someday, if it does work out, if you could sell a $100 share of a house or an apartment complex to someone in Uganda, right? Like that would be really cool if just tons of people could have shares, small micro shares, like they can have a coin or a token, like they can
That's
have
the vision.
A slice of Bitcoin, right?
I couldn't have articulated it better. That is the vision. If I can go to a party and somebody gives me a stock tip, I fish out my phone, I tap on E-Trade or Robinhood, and I buy it 5 seconds later. Why can't I do that for real estate? And the truth is, because every real estate property is so different from every other property, and there's no benchmark. There's no organizations in the background rating companies like Moody's or S&P 500. That process, I believe, will take decades.
And just as an aside, not that we can trust Moody's, because we all know what they did during the rating scandal of the Great Recession, right? But yeah, I get the idea. Sure, absolutely. Well, share with us a little bit about your outlook on the economy, the real estate market. I mean, if you ask me, the Fed has just screwed this up so badly. They waited way too long to raise and tighten, and now they've done it far too suddenly, and it's a shock to the system. They just should have tightened sooner, more gradually. That's my opinion. Feel free to differ, but what do you think? Where do you think the economy is going? I'm sure you probably think we're going to enter an official recession this year, a declared recession finally.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not going to play shoulda, coulda, woulda games. The Fed's job is actually not as simple because everything that the Fed does has a time lag. So
Yeah.
the Fed has to basically make guesses based on where the economy will be 6 to 9 months from now. Just because they're the Fed doesn't mean that they're better at guessing than you are or I am, right? So it's problematic for them. But here's where we stand today, right? So on the one side, we have a bipolar economy of the sort that I've never seen before. Not once. I haven't seen it in 2020. I haven't seen it in 2009. In 2009, clearly the economy was in the shitter. Everyone agreed on that. Today we have one set of economists pointing out to the fact that in December, the economy produced 233,000 jobs, which is a wonderful number at any given point of time. But it is a truly astonishing, out of this world number when the Federal Reserve is taking a howitzer to the economy. They're basically every 4 or 5 weeks bombing the US economy. And they've done it now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times in 7 months, which is by far the fastest pace in history. They've never actually done this kind of raises in 7 months in their entire history. And they've been forced to do that, as you mentioned, because of the catch-up. And so as they're bombing the economy is actually fighting or resisting what the Fed is doing in a way that is truly extraordinary. This has never happened before in history. You can go back all the way.
The economy is keeping the unemployment rate pretty low, despite
shockingly low.
all of the Fed's measures, right? and the Fed is trying to make unemployment go up.
Exactly. So here's the Federal Reserve. It starts doing this a year ago when unemployment was 3.5.
Right.
On December 31st, unemployment is 3.5.
Yeah.
So they've moved exactly 0 percentage points from where they were after 12 months of heavy bombing.
Yeah,
which
damn the Phillips curve doesn't care,
Exactly. I mean, in the past, there were always these people saying, yeah, but these are not real jobs. There's a lot of part-time jobs and wage growth is low. Wage growth is astonishing. Wage growth is 5.6%. That's triple what it used to be 3 years ago. So the economy is growing. Wage growth is very strong. Labor participation is down. So that's the one downer, but it's really difficult to bring 2 or 3 million people back into the workforce that are getting older. And labor force participation is a worldwide problem. We actually are the best in the world at it. China's the worst at this point. Japan's pretty bad. So labor force participation is a long-term problem. It's there's no short-term fix for it. So what does this do to real estate? Well, the truth is we had an absolutely astonishing run between March, 2020 and let's say July or August of this year. Home prices went up 34%. I mean, that makes no sense, right? Why would home prices go up 34%? So now we're in this retrenchment period where, depending upon the markets, we've already seen retrenchment. So the 3 markets in the US that have retrenched the most are Coeur d'Alene, very small market in Idaho, Austin, kind of biggest boom town in America, and San Jose, biggest, that's Silicon Valley. So those have retrenched by 10.6% each. And then there's other boom towns like Phoenix and Denver that are sort of heading in that direction. Boise, right? So Boise obviously was the kind of a poster child of a boom town. And they're not down 10% yet, but they're heading in that direction, with Coeur d'Alene being in the same state. So we're seeing that correction occur. And I'm seeing this fear of that correction as if the world is ending. And what I want to point out, Jason, is that if the entire real estate market in the US corrected by 15%, we would still be up a shocking number from March 2020. So retrenchment and correction is normal and should be factored into, because if you don't correct, then you end up in a everything bubble, which then bursts and then takes everything down for 4 or 5 years, like it did from between 2008 and 2013. So we're in that correction process. Multifamily is already corrected by 8 to 12%. Real estate, not so much. I mean, nationwide, it's only corrected about 3.5%. But what I'm seeing, which is good, is that the most bullish markets, the ones that exploded the most, are higher than that number. So they are 6, 7, 8, 10%, and I think they go another 5, 6, 7%. There could be markets in the US that correct to 20%. Like, I'll give you an example. Austin went up 72%, so if it corrects by 20%, It's still at 52% in 2 years.
Yeah, right.
What's wrong with that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, folks, did anybody in these cyclical boom markets really think that they were going to get to keep all of that appreciation? It's just ridiculous. You're just not going to keep all of that gain. It's more than you deserved. So give a little back, and let's not be too greedy here. But, just back to the Powell thing for a moment and the Fed, okay, which you started with. I know you don't want to play coulda, shoulda, woulda, but, and the Fed does have a lag to what they do. Obviously, we get it. But all of that time that Powell kept saying it's transitory, and everybody kept telling him, no, it's not transitory. He tried to blame it on the supply chain. And that was partly true, but they took a $4 trillion problem and pumped, 16 trillion in, right? It's just, they overdid it. And when you have the lowest interest rates in, according to David Graeber's book, Debt the First 5,000 Years, the lowest interest rates in 5,000 years. You've got to believe you're going to create an inflation problem there, right?
Yeah, and I think that what you mentioned had a lot to do with it, but I want you to keep this in mind. During COVID, the country that printed the most, whether you want to call it quantitative easing or actual money dropping, where you give money to people, either one of those, helicopter money, we did it the most. A few other countries did it. Yep. But please note that inflation is a worldwide problem.
Sure.
And inflation is, if you take a collection of 30 countries that did no money printing, their inflation would be higher than the United States. So our inflation, briefly went up into the nines. But today, the inflation worldwide, if you just take the United States out, is over 10%. And most of these countries didn't print. So I firmly believe that supply chain played a massive role in this process. And just as supply chain was adjusting, just as the Fed was going to get a break, the Russian war started and hiked oil up to 130. So I feel like I have to cut some slack to the Fed.
That's true.
Because the Fed could not have predicted oil going up $50 a barrel.
Yeah. The Russian invasion definitely was a huge impact on that. There's no question about it. But, those other countries don't have the reserve currency. So the U.S. has the opportunity to make its inflation rate lower. Let's assume, of course, we probably both believe that the measurements are highly manipulated. I certainly do. But let's assume they all manipulate the same way, right? For sake of discussion.
Other countries manipulate too. Yeah.
Of course. And so let's assume they're all understating their inflation rate, but the U.S., with the reserve currency status and the ability to import deflation to offset its inflation, really has a benefit by opening up the southern border and also importing cheap products from, of course, China and the others. So
no doubt, Jason.
The U.S. is in a very good position. I mean,
we're in an absolutely spectacular position. I often read stuff about the U.S. is screwed, which makes me chuckle. It makes me laugh because if we are screwed, then there are no countries in the world that aren't screwed because we lead a world order that has us at the very center of it. And it's not just that we're the center, we're the foundation itself of that world order. So, and the foundations of anything crumble last. So I think, problems always begin at the periphery, and we're seeing those problems in places like Sri Lanka and Pakistan that are basically falling apart. Right. But I want to go back to something that you said that I think is very important to me. I am not in any way suggesting that what we did was right. I think it was extremely foolish. I think that the Fed should have closed the tap sooner on their side. The Fed really does not control what the politicians do, so that was joint foolhardiness. Keep in mind that most of the money passing bills didn't pass by one vote. So Republicans and Democrats voted together. So I think it was extremely foolhardy. What I wanted to point out, though, was this was an instance where supply chain screwed every country in the world, including us.
Yeah, no question. I mean, the supply chain, and especially look at the construction materials, the lumber specifically.
Yeah, lumber is a perfect example because I have projects that were hurt very badly by it. So lumber is, or per 1,000 square feet of lumber was at 400 before COVID, stayed up around 1,200. So 3x, that's 300% in a year, and then went down to 1,200, floated around there for a while. And then people are like, no, this is forever. It's never going to come back down. Today, the price of lumber is lower than it was the day before COVID.
Right.
Lower.
Yeah.
It's lower than, $400. So all of that inflation was because of supply chain. There was nothing else there except for gouging and supply chain.
Yeah. So since we are talking about construction materials, another thing that's interesting, and I've done quite a few shows on this where I've discussed this concept, and that is that, of course, real estate is a very low-tech asset class. In other words, it's unlikely to be disrupted by some major innovation. I mean, unless we're all going to start living in force fields, I guess, we're going to have sticks and bricks pretty much. And of course, they talk about 3D printing. So far as I can tell, that's just total hype. I've done shows on that too.
Oh, I wouldn't call it hype. I just feel like this is just like the EVs, right? So we were supposed to have self-driving cars in 2016, 2018, 2020, and 2022.
Yep.
I'm not saying that we will never have self-driving cars. I think we've made tremendous progress in the last 8 years. But by its very nature, because technology requires a very large amount of capital, they're constantly lying. So every company that's in that business lies about the amount of time that it will take, and crypto companies were no different. And that's why they saw an 80-90% decline in valuation. The truth is, I think 3D printing is the future of real estate. But is it the future of this decade? God, no, they're so far. Right now, the cost of a 3D printed home is significantly higher than the cost of a normally printed home. All right. Solar, for example, 2010 was 10 times more expensive on a per kilowatt hour basis than it is in 2022, right? Mm-hmm. And we've had solar since the 1990s. So it took a long time to get to the point where the supply chain was built out enough to make it cheap. And I think that to think that we are going to have a substantial impact on the housing stock in this decade from 3D printing is just nonsensical. But I wouldn't bet against it happening next decade.
Okay, so here's the thing. The technology of 3D printing is really interesting. I mean, very little waste compared to traditional construction, which is lots of waste. We've all seen the dumpsters out in front of the houses they're building, right, and remodeling. And that's all good and it's fast. And, one of the problems we have is that the aging workforce of construction workers. I mean, these construction workers are not guys in their 20s anymore. The average construction worker is like 54 years old now. It's insane how old these guys are working on these construction sites. Just go out and look for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. But the thing about 3D printing is not the tool that builds it or the technology that designs it. It's that it's all made of atoms. Okay. And the material is a concrete composite type mixture most of the time. And that costs money. I mean, there are wars over sand because sand is the ingredient to concrete. And so, until there's some breakthrough in materials science, right? I don't know. We're going to make homes in the future out of graphene. Who knows? Who knows? That's the problem. It's the material, right? The 3D printer will make construction more efficient. It requires, like a couple of workers instead of a whole crew. That's all great. So you cut down on labor costs, but it still requires material. And that hasn't changed.
And again, the technology to 3D print certain portions of the home now exists. Again, it's not, scalable. It's very expensive, but no one has even talked about 10 years from now being able to 3D print windows, doors, roof tiles, pipes. So
cabinets?
I mean, right, exactly. How are you going to 3D print cabinets that people will actually like? Or what about, granite countertops? I think that what people have to understand is that we are, over the next 10 or 15 years, we'll get to the point where the skeleton of the home can be 3D printed. But there'll still be hundreds of workers required for a typical home for all of the things that cannot be 3D printed, and there's going to be no change in their costing. So I'm as excited as a technologist. I'm very excited about the potential of 3D printing, but I'm savvy about the amount of time that it takes to get there. And these things are very difficult. For example, the only company that has truly scaled this type of moving automation in the US is Amazon. So you see their warehouses and you see all those robots that move back and forth. And it's surprising to most people. It's like, oh, everyone should be doing this. The answer is automation is expensive.
Yeah.
And it's not only expensive to build, it's expensive to maintain. But Amazon, luckily, once it takes on a warehouse and has a 20-year lease, it doesn't need to move that warehouse. Well, the 3D printer needs to move every couple weeks.
Right. Yeah. Well, if it's building attractive homes, it needs to move to the next home. But yes, it needs to be disassembled, put on a truck, and moved completely, ultimately, to a whole new job site. I agree. I get it. And it's not a fair comparison when you look at a company like Amazon, because these tech companies, I mean, look, you're a tech guy, okay? They're so overfunded because we have this kind of winner take all capital formation in this country, which I think is very wrong, by the way, but it's just the way it is, right? We have, everything has sort of, even if it's not a tech company, it's kind of consolidated into, I mean, show me another coffee shop that's not a Starbucks, right? There's hardly
Amazon
any
has to
choice
be a
in the
tech company.
marketplace.
Otherwise, why are their PE multiples like a tech company, right? So to me, Amazon and Tesla are tech companies by the very, very virtue of looking at their price to earnings ratios, and they're astronomical. Well, then they must be looked at that way. And I don't want to get into whether that's right or wrong, but I think that's the way that the world is looking at them. So bottom line is, I mean, to get to the bottom line, real estate is extraordinarily difficult to disrupt. Technologists like me have looked at it for a long time as this is the place where we can make disruption. And it's not that we're doing poorly. I mean, from Zillow to Yardi Matrix to a bunch of other companies, there's disruption happening. The bits and bytes are being disrupted.
That's easy to disrupt.
Physical stuff, which is heavy, which has to be moved and has to be installed individually, is extraordinarily difficult. The other thing that is difficult is that the United States, by its very nature, is a country that gives its states an extremely large amount of autonomy compared to other countries, right?
Sure.
And so not only do we have 50 different states, each state has a county which has its own laws. Right. So real estate operates under several thousand laws, and unless the Democrats and Republicans get together, no one's even talking about this, and spend a decade building a uniform civil code, it's almost impossible to automate it in the first place.
Yeah, that's really a very good point you make about all of the laws governing it, and that's very hard to disrupt all of that. As profitable as investing is for me and my clients, it would be nice to end the housing shortage and really just make it more accessible, but I just don't know how that's going to happen. I mean,
well, I know.
It has to be cheaper and easier to build things and create more supply. Yeah.
I think the housing shortage ends in the next decade, and the answer the reason for that is this: no one that I have seen, with the exception of one person, her name is Ivy Zellman, so I-V-Y Zellman,
yeah, right,
talks about the fact that the demographics of the U.S., which were sharply positive in the 80s and 90s, turned sort of plateaued in the 2000s and have tanked in the 2010s.
Yep.
And that, because demographics take so much time to impact the market, there's no impact really today.
Birth rate or household formation?
Both,
age?
right? So we're talking about three pieces of it, right? And you just mentioned all of them. So first one's the birth rate, which doesn't affect us for the next decade, but affects us after that.
Right.
The second, because the birth rate started dropping at the beginning of the 2000s, so it's really going to affect us in 10 years from now.
You've got to lag it by about 25 years.
Exactly.
25
and
to
then,
30 years for household
and then
formation.
you've got household formation, right? Which started to drop, a while back, and it's continuing to drop because of, exponentially growing costs of both the real estate and food, which basically makes people form households later and later and later in life, and we're seeing that impact now, by the way.
Hey, Neal, avocado toast is more important than a house.
Yeah. Perfect analogy. I mean, this is what's happening, right? So when we look at demographics and how sharply negative the US's demographics have turned so quickly, we know that by 2030, the housing shortage, the numbers that I see for the housing shortage today are fairly credible. They're not exactly right. They're a little bit like inflation. They're a little overstated. But when I see the numbers by 2030, I'm absolutely convinced they're overstated, because they're not taking this demographic shift in mind. And so I think that the housing shortage ends sometime in the 2030s, because we're going to have an aging population, a lower birth rate, and we'll finally have caught up with that lower birth rate. So I do not think technology fixes this. I think demographics have fixed it already. We're just waiting to catch up with demographics.
So that's interesting. And the only thing I would say to that is, see, I think the housing shortage ends in about 2045 to 2050. That's when the demographics really shift. Okay. The thing I would say though is you've got to include immigration, which the US is one of the most open countries, most open to immigration of any, certainly any major country by far. And when you look at the compared to what question, right? And you look around the world and you look at how China's demographics are absolutely appalling. I mean, China is
Horrific.
over in 2030.
It's a time bomb.
Okay.
Yeah, they're finished.
In 2030, it's like the end of China, basically. I mean, it's
They're
not
finished.
like the country's going to end.
This is peak China in 2022. This is peak China right now.
Yeah, I agree. Couldn't agree more.
On this one, we disagree, and I'll tell you, why. I feel the fact that immigration is a politically hot topic, it hides the fact that immigration to the United States has been dropping, legal and illegal combined. So you got to combine those two numbers, right? So legal's been dropping sharper, illegal's been dropping slower. But if you look at actual immigration in the United States, it has been dropping. Now, it may plateau out this year because of the problems that we have on the southern border, but I bet you those are going to get fixed sooner or later. The Democrats will eventually wake up to the fact that they have to do something serious about this, and I think they're beginning to do that. The Republicans would say you should have done this 2 years ago, and they would be right. My point is that is a time-based problem that will be solved. Overall, immigration to the United States is down for one simple reason. There was always a party for it and a party against it. The truth is now the Democrats themselves are unwilling to put any kind of bills in the Senate or the House that increase immigration. And really that's what most countries are doing. 20 years from now, Germany, for example, is in deep doo-doo, so they're basically opening up immigration. So I don't think that the political will exists to change anything for the next decade or two. It really has to get very bad with corporations screaming saying we don't have any workers. I think that's a very long way away. So I don't think we do anything about immigration in the next 10 years because it's a political challenge. And I'm not seeing those numbers add up to the appalling reduction in our baby creation ability.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's no question about that. I mean, if you want to have a country, you got to have children, folks. That's it. Just ask Japan, Russia, Germany, all the rest. I mean, if they don't have children, they're just it's over. I was kind of approaching the immigration issue from the other side. I would say that the immigration issue, there has not been as much pressure or as much need for foreigners to immigrate to the U.S. over the last, really since globalization took off, okay? Mm-hmm. Because life has gotten better around the world, much mm-hmm. better, in fact. About 500 million people have been pulled out of poverty and joined the middle class, to whatever middle class means in that given country. And so, life used to be much tougher in those countries and much nicer in the US. And now that gap has gotten smaller. So that
almost everywhere. Yes. And it's not just India and China. I mean, it's happened across all of Asia and a significant portion of Africa. That has happened. So, but you're saying you think that's going to change? You think that this need for people to immigrate is going to flip around or reverse?
Well, I think that, like we talked about earlier when we talked about inflation affecting other countries more, and the US having the reserve currency and having it better than these other countries, I think as things continue to deteriorate, and I think they will overall continue to deteriorate, the only savior is technology. Mm-hmm. For everything. And, with the release of ChatGPT, a month and a half ago, I mean, that's like an amazing advance forward, possibly. I'd love to talk to you about that because, so you're not.
Yeah, the problem with ChatGPT again is we're yet to invent technology that moves physical things around. ChatGPT.
Let's go there in a second. Just hold that thought for a second. The thing I wanted to say about the immigration thing is I just think that gap is going to maybe start widening again. And before we get to the tech component, which I'd love to talk to you about, Neal, because you're really in that much deeper than I am. But I want to bring to your attention an article that has really changed my thinking a lot, that I read back around 2005. And Jeremy Siegel was quoted in this article. And he said, and it was a really interesting thought that I'd never really thought about quite the way he said it. He said that with the rising middle class around the world, all of these people, as they now have disposable income. And keep in mind, this article is 17 years old now. Okay.
Sure.
He said, where are all the assets for these new entrants into the middle class? Where are the assets for them to buy? They're going to start looking around for assets. As soon as you are past survival and you have your needs met, you start thinking about, well, I better invest. I better do something with my money, right? And he talked about the looming asset shortage. And I thought that was really interesting. And then you fast forward from that just a few years, and a whole new asset class was created, cryptocurrencies. And I would argue that that's not really that much of an asset class, except for Bitcoin, which is in a class by itself. And I don't think it's going to succeed wildly because the governments and central banks aren't going to let it happen. It's their competition. But it is an interesting idea that, there's just much more of a need for assets. People that money has to flow somewhere. And prosperity around the world has increased quite dramatically over the last 25 years.
Especially from a middle class perspective, right? So I just spent time in 3 countries. So for winter I took I went to Indonesia, to Thailand, and to Singapore, and it was interesting to see that 2005 article to now 17 years later. These people are investing in real estate in their own markets because their ability to invest in real estate outside of their country is either legally restricted or just very difficult. So people are spending astonishing amounts of money on real estate. And I'll give you an example of this, right? We consider US real estate to be very expensive, blah, blah, blah. It's too expensive, blah, blah, blah. US real estate as compared to our incomes, to our median income, is cheap. Canada's more expensive. The UK is ridiculously expensive. Singapore is just astronomical. Japan's expensive. So developed economies actually almost all
expensive than the US.
They're crazily expensive, right? Now do look at the fairly cheap economy. Thailand, people are earning on average $400 a month.
Mm-hmm.
But when you go to the island of Phuket, they've got 2 million, 3 million, 4 million USD in properties, right? Yep. So what's happening is that a significantly larger percentage of the money in these countries is going to real estate versus their stock market, because their stock markets are so crazy. They're so up and down like Bitcoin. I mean, the stock market of some of these third world countries resembles the level of fluctuation that you see in cryptocurrency, even though it's the actual stock market. So people don't trust it and they put money there. The Chinese are famous for putting everything into real estate. So I think that the assets are being built, but they're built in their country. Yeah. And yes, there's this feeling that somehow that money is going to end up in the United States. The truth is it is, but a tiny fraction.
Here's the thing, though. Those assets require the same basic raw materials that are essentially demonetized because they're not attached to any one currency. Lumber is needed by every human on earth, and it's traded around the world, and it doesn't matter if it's a yen, a euro, a ruble, or whatever you're trading it in, it's still a piece of wood is worth what a piece of wood costs, right? I mean, look, as China has developed and caused all these shortages in steel, concrete, copper wire, it's pushed the worldwide price of those items up. So it makes those construction materials more expensive. It doesn't matter if a dollar never hits the US, all the materials got more expensive to build the house because of the demand in the other country.
But it's stopping. I mean, China is probably going to build 30% in the next decade of what it built in the previous decade. They built massive amounts. So China's now reached this extreme, stopping point. And because they were causing most of the inflation in the world in steel and concrete and all these other materials, we actually catch a breather for about 7 or 8 years. And then a new hydra rears its head, and that's India, where I come from. Right. And India gets to the point where it says, okay, now we're going to suck up all of the available supply of everything in the world, and we're going to basically end up building 20 mega cities, 10 million people each, which is what China has finished doing.
Well, India is about to surpass China in population. I mean, India is the next big
thing. It is,
but
they're not quite ready, right, to be honest, to build these extraordinary mega cities that China has built. I mean, China builds a New York-sized city every 3 months.
Right.
India builds one every 3 years.
China has an advantage. It's a communist country. India is a democracy, right? And say what you will about communism, but it can be efficient.
It can be very efficient when top-down communism.
Everybody has to move, and who cares about the environment? They can just do whatever
they
want.
They get stuff done extraordinarily quickly. So I think that's why I think we'll catch a breather on the cost of everything for about 10 years before India gets to the point where their economy becomes efficient enough and large enough to basically suck all of that spare production out. So we're going to catch a break there. The other thing that's happening is deglobalization. So the world is now fracturing again into sections. We're now becoming we used to be the free trade champion of the world. We're now a trade protectionist country. Right. And so as that happens, you're going to see trade more happen, inside of the continent. So Canada and Mexico, we're going to trade with them more. We're going to trade less with China. So I think that's going to insulate us from construction cost increases to some level.
But overall, that's inflationary.
That's inflationary because right. you have to basically build that infrastructure that you built in China. You have to now build it in Mexico or in Canada or in the U.S.
with North American labor standards and environmental rules, which are much more expensive to comply with than anything in China.
But the truth is, I think, Jason, 10% of that is going to get built in the U.S. A lot of it is going to get built in Mexico because what we're seeing now is that you do not want this stuff to come 12,000 miles away, especially if the Chinese are going to attack Taiwan, because that'll lock up that entire area and there'll be no trade there for a year or two. I mean, these things take time. The Ukraine war is now 12 months old, and I'm not sure that we're in the second half of the war yet, and we might still be in the first half. Given that, I think that a lot of this stuff is going to end up getting built in Mexico. So one of the tips that I offer people is this. I mean, I study deglobalization or reglobalization or reshoring, whatever you want to call it, whatever the terms are. It's very clear that the easiest winner for real estate people to go after is Mexico. Luckily, there's only a few freeways that bring material from Mexico to the United States. Most of it will come by road. Very little of it is going to come by any other way. There's no waterways. Simply go and look at those freeways and look at the industrial towns along those freeways, not necessarily Dallas or Houston, but look at industrial towns like San Antonio and look at how their demand for industrial is going to skyrocket 10x, 20x, 30x, and then anything around that is going to get built up because essentially what's going to happen is stuff that now comes in, trillions of tons of stuff that comes in from our ports is going to come in from a set of freeways that we built with Mexico. Everything along those, Texas obviously the big beneficiary, is going to explode. The amount of this stuff is massive. I mean, there's several hundred ships a day.
That's a big shift now. So when you think of the Pacific Rim and you look at the ports in LA and San Francisco area and
New Jersey,
those are going to suffer, and a lot of that
massively.
Traffic is going to be moved to trucking in the US. And if those trucks become self-driving, that's going to be more efficient too. So yeah,
I think they will, because what will happen is, self-driving for trucks is actually a much easier problem to solve mathematically than for cars, especially if they're on fixed routes, right? So if like for example, San Antonio down to not quite Mexico City, but some of their closer towns that are developing and exploding on their side is about 400 miles. So a Tesla truck, which has a 500-mile radius, could be programmed to run on that route back and forth continuously, right? So you're not solving a complex mathematical problem. So you're going to see an extraordinary amount of technology used to move stuff from Mexico to the southern border of the United States. Not necessarily move it beyond that. I think beyond that, it just becomes traditional trucking and traditional rail.
And the river network in the U.S. is pretty awesome. The only problem is it's
incredible.
So the levels are so low, you can't ship anything on the Mississippi at the moment. But
that's right. We need more rain. But still, I think that even with the problems that we have, the United States has easily the world's best river trade system.
Oh,
No
no
one
question.
else in the world even comes close to it. We have 13,000 miles
Yeah.
of river, and I think we're going to start using it again because it'll start to make sense as we reshore, right? So as we reshore, we're not just reshoring from Mexico, we're also reshoring from Canada. I mean, you mentioned timber. What most Americans think that our timber comes from China. It doesn't. All of it
Oh,
comes
it's
from
Canada.
Canada.
Yeah,
It's
of course.
Canadians that are
Yeah.
basically sending us our lumber because it's too expensive to bring it in from China, and China's using all of their lumber. They're not really exporting anything.
Right, right. Good stuff. Well, Neal, I could talk to you forever, but we do have to wrap it up. But I want to give you a chance to talk about the technology thing that we sort of postponed that point because we did mention Chat GPT, and you apparently don't think this is that amazing. I think it's the prelude to passing the Turing test, you know?
No, I don't. I think that general artificial intelligence is still decades away simply because of the nature of general artificial intelligence. I'm a technologist, so I understand what ChatGPT does.
Yeah.
It doesn't make it any less remarkable. It is truly astonishing, and we'll find not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of different applications, but it's only moving bits and bytes. And that restricts its usage. So I think that copywriters will go out of business, social media people will go out of
Yeah.
business, right? So it's basically going to, over the next decade, and this will happen pretty quickly. Remember, only bits and bytes are involved, so the rollout is exponential in nature. It's not linear like it is with things that are heavy. So I think 10 years from now, it's going to eat up entire industries. It's going to be extremely dramatic. But I think that the challenge is this: technology was already doing a good job of taking some of these jobs away. So many of our copywriters, my copywriters, live in the Philippines. So what's really going to happen, a lot of people outside the US are going to lose their jobs, and a lot of people in the US are going to lose their jobs. So I think it's destructive in the sense that I think it is over a decade, $1 trillion technology, but there's other technologies out there that are 10 trillion or $100 trillion technologies that I think are bigger. So in the meantime,
Care
though,
to mention one or two of those?
well,
Is it?
I think that to me, this process of reindustrialization, this process of bringing all of our supply chains back to our own continent is going to be $100 trillion opportunity over 2 decades, simply because you cannot drive the numbers down. Technology only helps to a certain level, and we've already reached that tipping point where technology can't help with that as much anymore. So I think the dollar numbers there are massively, enormously larger. So I think that there's technologies that are huge. The other one that is not a big one for this decade, but arguably is the largest for the next decade, is the implementation of true self-driving. So Tesla recently rolled out its beta to anyone that has a Tesla car, which
My
I was
friend bought it
surprised to see.
for his Tesla. Yeah,
Right.
$12,000. Yeah.
And I don't think it's ready. I think it's but if you look at technology exponentially, because it's not linear, it's exponential. Bits and bytes are exponential. When you forward move what Tesla's done with this technology in the last 5 years and move it forward 5 years, they will certainly get to the point where TaaS becomes a reality. TaaS is transportation as a service,
Yep.
where you basically, it's Uber, but it's 100 times better than Uber, right? So cars as a service, but essentially you get to the point where a newer generation than ours simply would feel stupid buying a car, right? So they would simply share a car, just the way that they use Netflix. And we bought VCRs and DVD players, and they kind of laugh at that because they're sharing the internet. They're sharing the same bit, the same byte.
It's
100 million people
network.
are watching it. Exactly.
Same with cars. Yeah.
Cars will become a distributed network, and what will drive it is the green parties. The green parties will recognize that this is highly beneficial from a carbon benefit perspective. So they're going to create laws for it. They're going to basically subsidize it to the nth degree to make that possible. It also agrees with their political views of sharing everything, the somewhat socialist view that everything in the economy should be and must be shared, blah blah blah. So I think it appeals to
be happy.
it definitely appeals to the left greatly, and so they'll put money into it. So TaaS, I think, fundamentally changes the United States in one simple way. We built a freeway system in the 50s. Everything we did in real estate since then was based on that. If that changes, then everything changes. And also for real estate, 800 million parking lots become available for redevelopment a decade from now.
About 40% of any given city is dedicated to parking. So just think, if you can summon your car and there are cars all around and you have a car in seconds.
Someone's car, not yours.
Well,
Someone's
a
car.
Car. That's what I mean. And there's no need for parking because these cars never stop running, basically. They're like a Southwest plane. They keep going all the time. Yeah, that just changes everything. You know, one of the market analysts I had on the show told me that parking garages are being built for easy conversion to office or residential. They're being built with 10-foot plates, and they're being designed so they can easily be converted because they know that's coming. The lessening need for the parking lot business would not be a recommendation. Okay.
I mean, it's just, you know, the gas business, the auto body, you know, collision business, and the parking business will not exist in 10 years. The auto insurance business will not exist 10 years from now. All of these businesses will go out, and I can tell you we will have a real estate depression in this country for at least a decade because we will simply create an astonishingly large amount of land that we don't have access to today.
Right. But it's interesting to think, what could that land be used for? Like, you see, okay, there's some parking lots in a city, there's some parking on the street. I think it'll just make all these cities a lot nicer, you know, without all
for
the
some amount of
parking,
time,
you know, and things like that. You know, it'll just look a lot nicer, you know. I don't know. It's sort of interesting because that also, you know, if we're not building highways, we reduce the need for concrete and construction materials and construction workers and all those drivers that'll be laid off. I mean, you know,
a TAS network uses roughly 12% of the freeway systems of the US. It doesn't need to use the rest because cars can be within a few inches. Packing density. So when you do that, I mean, you're going to end up repurposing a significant portion of all freeways in the United States. And it's coming much faster because bits and bytes. Once again, cars have been turned into bits and bytes when it comes to the TAS component, right? And Uber is a phenomenal example of how quickly this scales across the world. I went to 3 countries. They had their own Uber called Grab, so other companies are there. Grab was much more advanced than Uber. They did many more things. They had many more services. So the ability to digitize within a single decade is phenomenal. And again, this is in contrast with 3D printing, which you can't digitize as easily because there's physical material involved. But cars already exist, and upgrading a car to become, not that hard once you get the technology going. It's maybe a $2,000, $3,000 kit to retrofit an existing car to do that. And I'm sure Tesla will be selling truckloads of those kits if they end up being that company that succeeds. So I just feel like there is an absolute massive earthquake that shifts the real estate landscape 7, 8, 9 years from now.
Well, here's the other thing it does is that, you know, the 3 primary rules of real estate have always been location, location, location. Is location that? I would always make the example of, you know, what if you love to surf and you live in San Diego, California, right? Because you love to surf and you got to live in San Diego or Orange County or LA, right? Where the waves are. But then you think, well, I don't need my expensive multi-million-dollar house here anymore by the beach because I can just live inland. I can live in Phoenix or, you know, someplace inland. And every Friday evening, I can jump in my self-driving car at midnight and I can go to sleep and I can wake up at the beach and I can surf and it can drive me back that night after a day of surfing, you know? So the location, like, think of what that does to high-end real estate that's value is driven by location. It lessens the value of it and increases the value of lower priced real estate, which is not being highly priced because of location. So it displaces that value equation.
Well, it allows us to use more of the US. I mean, the US only uses about 3 to 4% of our land. And we're landlocked because of the freeway system, because of this issue with traffic. All of a sudden, more of the US becomes available, basically solves all future real estate zoning problems and land use problems and in a decade from now. So I'm looking to get out of the real estate business in about 5 or 6 years.
That's interesting. I think you're a little early. That's where I disagree with you. I think you ought to get out around 2040 or 2042. That's my opinion. But
Bits and bytes goes faster.
We can disagree on that.
I think we agree on the principle.
Yeah. The one thing we will agree on is that software is eating the world. No question about that. Neal, give out a website or anything where you'd like people to find you.
Yeah, so I happen to be the only Neal Bawa on the web. So on the screen, you see my name, Nealbawa. Just Google me. I talk about lots of things, technology, and then I talk about their impact on real estate. For example, we talked about climate change. Whether it's real or not, it's having an impact on real estate. And so we have those kinds of conversations. And the website that we store this information, 20 webinars a year, is Multifamily University. So just go in and type Multifamily University. Even though it's called that, we talk about all kinds of real estate, actually.
Good stuff. Neal, thanks so much for joining us. Really spirited discussion. I love it.
Loved it, Jason. This was amazing.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.